Harriet Tubman's life has been the subject of countless biographies, documentaries, and historical accounts, yet there remains a chilling gap in the way we remember her, a truth that is often left unspoken, a side of her story that America was never truly ready to admit. At the core of the myth of Harriet Tubman is the heroic, almost saintly image of the Moses of her people, a figure who led enslaved people to freedom through the Underground Railroad. But beyond the iconic image of a courageous woman guiding others to freedom, there is a darker, far more unsettling narrative, one that has remained hidden in the shadows of history for too long. The untold truth of Harriet Tubman is that, while she was undoubtedly a beacon of hope for many, she was also deeply affected by the horrors of slavery, and the consequences of those experiences ran far deeper than we have been willing to acknowledge. Tubman was a woman who, in many ways, lived in two worlds, the world of light, hope, and salvation she provided for others, and the world of darkness, trauma, and mental anguish that she carried inside herself. What is often left out of the historical accounts is the psychological toll that her work and her past took on her, the haunting episodes of visions and strange behavior that many dismissed as mere eccentricities, or worse, as signs of madness. This chilling truth begins to emerge in the quietest moments of her life, the moments that history conveniently ignored or misunderstood. Tubman's most well-known stories, those of heroic escapes and daring missions, are lauded for their courage and strength, but there are also lesser-known episodes that paint a far more complex and enigmatic picture. One such story, a quiet, almost unsettling episode from her later years, casts a shadow over the heroic narrative we've come to embrace. It was during her time in Auburn, New York, where she settled after the end of the Civil War, that Tubman's story began to shift in tone. She had already gained national recognition as a fearless conductor on the Underground Railroad, but now, away from the headlines and the crowds, she was confronted by a very different kind of battle, a personal battle with the demons of her past. In the years that followed her escape from slavery, Tubman's health began to deteriorate, both physically and mentally. She suffered from narcolepsy, a condition that caused her to suddenly fall into deep, uncontrollable sleep, a condition that some of her contemporaries believed to be the result of the brutal head injury she had sustained as a young woman when she was struck by a weight while attempting to defend another enslaved person from an overseer's attack. But narcolepsy was just one aspect of the strange and troubling symptoms that began to emerge as Tubman's life continued. In the quiet hours of the night, she would sometimes speak of visions, vivid, often disturbing images of spirits, of dreams that seemed to beckon her towards something beyond the world of the living. These experiences were not simple hallucinations, they were deeply spiritual encounters, in which Tubman believed she was being guided by forces greater than herself, forces that connected her to something beyond the physical world. For some, these visions were interpreted as signs of divine inspiration, as the kind of spiritual guidance one might expect from a woman who had been instrumental in saving so many lives. But for others, these episodes were more troubling. They were signs of a woman who had endured too much, whose mind had become a battleground between the horrors of her past and the spiritual forces she sought to connect with. And as these visions intensified, so too did the isolation that Tubman began to experience. In the town of Auburn, where Tubman lived after the war, the community was largely composed of white abolitionists and sympathizers who had admired her courage. But while they lauded her as a hero, they were also uncomfortable with the more mystifying aspects of her character. Some viewed her visions and her spiritual practices with suspicion, labeling her as eccentric or even mad. For a woman who had been a symbol of strength and resilience, this public dismissal of her more mysterious qualities was a deeply painful blow. In a society that was already quick to dismiss the mental health of black women, Tubman's struggles were ignored or misunderstood, leading to a growing sense of alienation. Despite this, Tubman's resolve never wavered. She continued to work for causes she believed in, advocating for women's suffrage and providing for the care of freed African Americans, particularly in the case of her own family. But as the years wore on, the toll of her past experiences began to manifest in increasingly unsettling ways. She became reclusive, withdrawn, and less visible in the public eye. Tubman's once bold presence, the fierce woman who had defied the odds to lead others to freedom, was now overshadowed by a woman who had seen too much, whose spirit had been marked by the trauma of her past. Perhaps the most disturbing part of this untold truth is the way in which Harriet Tubman's life became a subject of suppression, not just in her own time, but also in the years that followed her death. The myth of the hero who was unscathed by the horrors of slavery, who stood tall and unbroken in the face of incredible adversity, became so ingrained in the American consciousness that it left little room for the more complex, more painful truths of Tubman's life. The historical narrative, in its eagerness to celebrate her as a national hero, downplayed or outright ignored the toll that slavery had taken on her mind and body. The reality was far more complicated than the simple tale of a fearless woman leading others to freedom. This is the untold truth of Harriet Tubman, a woman whose legacy is not just one of bravery and strength, but also one of trauma, of psychological scars that were never fully addressed. Her courage was undeniable, but her pain was equally real. And as we look back on her life today, we must ask ourselves, are we willing to acknowledge the full complexity of her story, or will we continue to accept the sanitized version that fits so neatly into the hero narrative we've created? To understand the true depth of Harriet Tubman's legacy, we must be willing to confront not just her triumphs, but also her struggles, the parts of her story that have been left out, ignored, or erased from history. Only then can we truly appreciate the incredible strength it took for Tubman to survive not only slavery but also the haunting memories and psychological scars that followed her escape. Tubman was, without question, one of the greatest heroes in American history. But to truly honor her, we must acknowledge the price she paid for that heroism, and the darkness she carried with her every step of the way. In the quiet town of Auburn, New York, Harriet Tubman found a semblance of peace after decades of unimaginable hardship. The town, with its picturesque streets, shaded groves, and tranquil surroundings, seemed like an unlikely place for someone with her past to settle. It was a place that, on the surface, stood in stark contrast to the traumatic history she had endured as an enslaved person in Maryland. Yet, Auburn was the town where she would spend the final years of her life, after she had helped lead dozens of enslaved people to freedom along the Underground Railroad. Auburn was not just a peaceful town, it was a place of stark historical significance. Located in the Finger Lakes region of New York, it was a key location in the abolitionist movement, home to several prominent anti-slavery activists, including William H. Seward, a U.S. Senator and Secretary of State who was a staunch advocate for the abolition of slavery. It was also a town with its own complexities, where the promise of freedom, justice, and equality often clashed with the realities of social and racial divisions. For Tubman, Auburn was the final destination after years of perilous escape, a place where she could rest from the battles she had fought for freedom. But even here, in the relative safety of this northern town, the scars of her past lingered. When Tubman arrived in Auburn, she did so with a singular vision: to establish a home for her family and for others who had been freed from slavery. She purchased a small farm, which became a sanctuary for the formerly enslaved. But even more importantly, it became a site where Tubman could care for the people she had helped, offering them the stability that had eluded them for so many years. It was here in Auburn that she would spend her later years in relative obscurity, away from the public eye that had once celebrated her as a hero and liberator. But even in her retreat, there was something about her presence that seemed to resonate with the town's history, with the very essence of the struggle for freedom. In the quiet of her farm, Tubman found a refuge of sorts. But it was also here that her personal struggles, those that had begun long before her escape from slavery, came into sharper focus. Tubman was not a woman untouched by trauma, she was deeply affected by the experiences of her youth and the years she spent in bondage. Her memory was haunted by the people she had lost, the friends she had seen whipped and tortured, the families she had seen torn apart. She carried the weight of these experiences with her every day, and it began to take a toll on her mind and body. Her time in Auburn, while relatively peaceful in comparison to the years of escape and resistance, was marked by moments of profound psychological strain. Tubman's life in slavery had been one of constant danger and fear. She had narrowly escaped death on several occasions, both as a young woman attempting to flee and later as a conductor on the Underground Railroad. The physical and emotional toll of these experiences, combined with the brutalizing nature of her time as an enslaved person, left deep scars. Tubman's struggles with her mental health became more pronounced in the years following her arrival in Auburn, where she began to experience disturbing episodes that were often dismissed by others. One of the most striking aspects of Tubman's life after the Civil War was her apparent ability to communicate with the spiritual world. It was during her time in Auburn that she began to have vivid dreams and visions that many of those around her found unsettling. Tubman spoke often of these visions, describing them as spiritual revelations that guided her in her work and in her life. For Tubman, these were not just dreams, they were deeply meaningful experiences, messages from the beyond that called her to action. Some of these visions were said to be prophetic in nature, providing Tubman with guidance on her missions to help enslaved people escape. Others were more cryptic, focused on her own personal struggles. These dreams and visions were, in many ways, her way of dealing with the weight of the trauma she had carried for so long. The separation from her family, the brutal physical abuse she had endured, and the emotional scars of the long years of slavery were all manifesting in her mind in the form of these eerie, otherworldly experiences. She believed that they were the voices of the ancestors, the spirits of the people who had fought and died for freedom before her. But these experiences were not always comforting. As Tubman's health began to decline, the line between the physical world and the spiritual world seemed to blur for her. Her visions became more frequent and intense. She would often see the spirits of those who had died in bondage, people she had known or helped, calling out to her. She would sometimes speak to these spirits as though they were present in the room with her, as though they were still alive. It was as though the ghosts of her past would not leave her, constantly pulling her back into the depths of her trauma. Tubman's psychological state began to deteriorate in a way that was impossible for the people around her to ignore. But it is important to recognize that her symptoms were not the result of simple madness or hysteria, as some historians might suggest. Tubman was a woman who had experienced extreme physical and emotional trauma. Her years of enslavement, coupled with the relentless demands of the Underground Railroad, had left her with a mental and emotional burden that no one could truly understand. The visions, the hallucinations, were not merely a sign of her insanity, they were the manifestation of her unresolved pain, of the deep and lasting wounds that slavery had left on her soul. As Tubman's health worsened, the people of Auburn, many of whom had once revered her as a hero, began to distance themselves from her. While she had been celebrated for her courageous work on the Underground Railroad, there was little sympathy for the woman who was now struggling with the demons of her past. Tubman's spiritual practices and the unsettling nature of her visions were often met with skepticism, and some even saw them as signs of instability. Her once vibrant presence in the community began to fade as she withdrew into her own world, leaving behind a legacy that was more complicated and tragic than many had initially realized. The quiet isolation that Tubman experienced in Auburn was compounded by the larger social and racial dynamics of the time. Although she had been a key figure in the abolitionist movement, Tubman was still a black woman living in a society that was deeply segregated and racist. Even in a place like Auburn, which had a reputation for progressive values, Tubman was still marginalized. The people who had once admired her for her bravery and leadership now looked at her with suspicion or pity. She was no longer the heroic figure leading others to freedom, she was a woman who had been broken by the very system of oppression she had fought against. This period of isolation marked the final chapter of Tubman's life. She had endured so much, the physical brutality of slavery, the constant threat of death, the overwhelming pressure of leading others to safety, that it was perhaps inevitable that her mental and emotional health would eventually break down. In Auburn, she found a small measure of peace, but it was a peace that was often overshadowed by the ghosts of her past. Tubman had done what she could to help others, but the cost to her own psyche was immeasurable. In this final chapter, Auburn became not just a place of refuge, but a symbol of Tubman's struggle to reconcile the hero she had been with the person she had become. The town offered her safety, but it also served as a reminder of the tremendous toll that slavery and its aftermath had taken on her. Tubman's story in Auburn is not just one of triumph, but also of the deep, unresolved pain that lingered within her, a pain that few were willing to acknowledge, and even fewer were equipped to understand. And so, Harriet Tubman's legacy, like the town of Auburn itself, remains steeped in complexity. It is a legacy not just of courage and freedom, but of survival, of the scars left by a brutal system that sought to break her spirit. While Tubman may have found a semblance of peace in Auburn, her journey was far from over. The psychological and emotional weight of her past would continue to haunt her in ways that history has often been reluctant to admit. As Harriet Tubman spent her final years in Auburn, the echoes of her past continued to haunt her, and the stories of her time on the Underground Railroad were slowly being overshadowed by more troubling rumors. While her reputation as a fearless conductor was widely celebrated, there were darker undertones to the narrative, signs of distress that many refused to acknowledge or understand. The early days of Tubman's life in Auburn were marked not only by her work to help former slaves build new lives but also by the more private struggles she began to face. In these early years, she was already known for the courageous missions she had undertaken. Her work had earned her the admiration of abolitionists and former slaves alike. But few outside of her immediate circle were aware of the emotional and psychological cost of her mission. It wasn't just the physical exhaustion or the toll of living under constant threat, it was the haunting memories, the trauma of constantly witnessing the brutality of slavery, and the never-ending grief for the loved ones she had lost, many of whom she had not been able to save. It was this trauma that began to take root, perhaps more deeply than many people realized, shaping her days in ways that could not be easily explained away. One of the most unsettling things that began to emerge during Tubman's time in Auburn was her tendency to experience what many referred to as visions. These were not simple dreams or fleeting thoughts but vivid, almost overwhelming experiences that seemed to transport her beyond the physical world. Tubman would sometimes speak of these visions to those around her, recounting the encounters she believed she had with spirits, with the dead, and with mysterious forces that seemed to guide her actions. These were not the gentle, comforting dreams one might expect from a woman of faith. Instead, they were sometimes distressing, filled with images of suffering, death, and the anguished cries of those she could not save. For Tubman, these visions were not mere figments of imagination, they were messages, signals from the beyond that she felt she had to heed. For a woman like Tubman, whose entire life had been defined by struggle and survival, it is not difficult to imagine how these experiences could have been a form of coping, an attempt to make sense of the violence and heartbreak she had witnessed. Perhaps these visions were a manifestation of the psychological trauma she had endured, an outlet for the grief that had accumulated over years of witnessing unimaginable suffering. Tubman had seen children torn away from their mothers, families sold and separated, and individuals subjected to the most brutal forms of cruelty. Perhaps the spirits she encountered in her visions were simply representations of the deep emotional wounds she carried within her, manifestations of the people she had lost along the way, the lives she had failed to protect. Yet, for others, Tubman's behavior was unsettling. Some began to wonder if these visions were a sign of something more sinister. Was she simply a woman deeply affected by the horrors of her past, or was there something more at play? To those unfamiliar with the mental toll of such experiences, her behavior seemed erratic. Tubman would sometimes talk to herself in a way that seemed to suggest a conversation with unseen forces. In some instances, her outbursts seemed almost unhinged. She would speak as though guided by voices, responding to questions no one could hear, her eyes darting around as if watching something invisible. In the context of the time, when medical and psychological knowledge was limited, these strange behaviors were often viewed through the lens of superstition and religious fervor. Some saw Tubman's visions as signs of divine communication, believing that her connection to the spiritual world was a gift, an extension of the deeply held faith that had driven her throughout her life. Others, however, were less sympathetic. The more conservative members of the community viewed her actions with suspicion, perhaps even fear. To them, Tubman's reliance on these visions, her deep spiritualism and the belief that she was being guided by forces beyond this world, was troubling. Her once celebrated status as a leader and hero now became complicated, as whispers of her mental instability began to spread. One can only imagine how isolating this must have been for Tubman. She had fought for freedom for so many, leading others toward liberty and safety, but in the end, she was left to battle her own demons in silence. The very people who had once celebrated her were now questioning her sanity. In the quiet of Auburn, Tubman's physical and emotional isolation deepened. She had always been a woman of action, a woman who was unyielding in her determination to fight for justice. But now, in the twilight years of her life, she found herself in a different kind of battle, a battle with her mind, with her memories, and with a society that had grown increasingly distant from the complexities of her inner world. As the years passed, Tubman's family and friends noticed that her behavior seemed to shift even further. She began to withdraw more from public life, avoiding interactions with those who had once been close to her. Her health continued to decline, and her bouts of narcolepsy became more frequent and debilitating. She could no longer continue the work she had once been so passionate about, and the reality of her fading health became impossible to ignore. Those around her could see that the powerful, determined woman who had once been unstoppable was now struggling, not just physically but mentally. The very qualities that had made her a hero, her strength, her resolve, and her unshakable faith, were now being tested in ways that even she couldn't control. In the midst of this struggle, Tubman also began to experience what many would later describe as a sense of spiritual exhaustion. For so long, she had relied on her faith to guide her through the darkest times of her life. Her belief in divine providence had sustained her during her perilous missions on the Underground Railroad and had been a source of strength when her own life was at risk. But now, in her later years, Tubman began to question the nature of that faith. Were the visions she had experienced truly messages from God, or were they simply the manifestations of a mind pushed to the brink? Was she still the woman who had been guided by divine forces, or was she now just another person lost in the wilderness of her own mind? The psychological toll of her years as an abolitionist, a spy, and a conductor had been immense, and it wasn't something that could be easily understood by those around her. As Tubman's health deteriorated, she also faced the bitter reality that the battle she had fought so long and hard for, the battle for freedom and equality, was far from won. The country was still divided, the legacy of slavery was still embedded in the fabric of American society, and the people she had once helped were still fighting for their rights. Perhaps this was the ultimate tragedy of Harriet Tubman's later years, that despite her monumental achievements and the lives she had saved, the war she had fought was far from over. The world around her had changed, but the struggle for true freedom was still a long and painful journey. In a sense, Tubman's later years in Auburn were marked not by a sense of completion but by an ongoing reckoning with the cost of her lifelong fight for justice. She had given everything she had to the cause, but as she retreated from the public eye, it became clear that the toll of that sacrifice had been far greater than anyone had truly understood. As Tubman continued to grapple with her declining health and the unraveling of her mental state, her once celebrated reputation as a fearless leader began to fade. The woman who had been a beacon of hope for so many was now a figure in retreat, a woman whose complexity and vulnerability were being obscured by the mythology of her heroism. But in the silence of her final years, it became increasingly evident that Harriet Tubman's story was not simply one of triumph over adversity, it was also a story of survival, of enduring the kind of trauma that had the power to fracture even the strongest of spirits. It was this struggle, this quiet, painful battle with the ghosts of her past, that would define Tubman's final years. Despite the growing sense of isolation that marked her later life, Harriet Tubman remained, in many ways, a woman of remarkable strength and resilience. She was a survivor of slavery, a hero to many, and a symbol of courage. But in the deepest recesses of her mind, she was also a woman who carried the weight of her past with her, a weight that could never be fully understood by those who had not shared her experiences. And as Tubman's health declined, and as the whispers about her mental state grew louder, it was clear that the true cost of her heroism, the emotional and psychological toll of fighting for others' freedom, was a burden that would never truly leave her. As Harriet Tubman's later years passed, the whispers about her behavior began to spread beyond her small circle of family and friends. What had once been seen as the eccentricities of a remarkable woman, someone who had led a life marked by near miraculous courage and profound faith, was now being questioned more openly. Tubman's interactions with the spiritual realm, her strange visions, and even her reclusive nature became subjects of growing speculation. The once celebrated hero was now a figure of quiet mystery, her mind and actions increasingly obscured by the shadow of doubt and confusion that many around her were reluctant to confront. In the small town of Auburn, Tubman's presence had been commanding for years. But as the years wore on, the story of the woman who had helped hundreds of slaves escape to freedom, the woman whose life was a testament to resilience and defiance, became intertwined with a more troubling narrative. For some, Tubman's behavior seemed less like a continuation of her unwavering commitment to the cause of freedom and more like the actions of someone unhinged by the weight of her past. In the absence of understanding, the people who had once revered her began to whisper. It is crucial to remember that Tubman's condition was not easily understood, not just by the people around her but by the medical community as well. The psychological trauma of slavery, combined with the brutal nature of her work as a conductor on the Underground Railroad, had left scars deeper than any physical injury. Tubman's work in the Underground Railroad was not simply an act of physical endurance, it was a mental and emotional trial, one that took a toll on her ability to cope with the suffering and trauma she had witnessed over the years. The more she tried to heal the world around her, the more she found herself facing an internal battle that few could comprehend. By the time Tubman had settled into her later years in Auburn, she had already suffered a great deal, not just physically, but emotionally. The trauma she carried was not a one-time burden, nor was it something she could easily set aside. It was a weight that continued to grow heavier, manifesting in ways that were at times troubling and, to those unfamiliar with her struggles, incomprehensible. Her narcolepsy, for instance, was a condition that had been with her for years, but as she aged, the episodes became more pronounced and more frequent. These sudden, uncontrollable episodes of sleep were disorienting and frightening, not just for Tubman but for those who were with her at the time. At times, she would simply fall asleep without warning, her body giving out from exhaustion, leaving her vulnerable and disoriented. Her health, already fragile from the strain of her earlier years, was now in decline. Yet, it was the spiritual visions that truly set her apart in the eyes of the public. Tubman's belief in divine intervention, in the idea that she was being guided by a higher power, was not new. Throughout her life, she had often spoken of being guided by visions and dreams, which had helped direct her actions. These experiences had been crucial to her work on the Underground Railroad, as she often felt that she was following a divine path that led her to safety and success in her missions. But as time went on, these visions became increasingly frequent and more intense, and for many, they began to blur the line between spiritual guidance and mental instability. Some of the visions Tubman described were eerily specific, moments where she would see the faces of people she had known or helped in the past. She would speak of hearing voices, of receiving messages that told her to take specific actions or go to certain places. To those around her, these instances were troubling, particularly when she spoke of hearing the voices of the dead, people she had lost, those she had failed to rescue, or even individuals she had never known personally. These were not visions that filled her with peace or comfort, they were disquieting and often unnerving. Tubman would speak to these voices, as though they were real, engaging in full conversations with spirits who were not visible to anyone else. Her family, those who had supported her over the years, began to witness this behavior with growing concern. They knew Tubman as a woman of deep faith, but they also knew her as a woman who had been tested beyond measure. To them, her visions were not the simple result of some divine calling but rather the manifestation of years of pain, loss, and the physical toll her body had endured. Tubman had endured numerous hardships throughout her life, the years of physical abuse and deprivation as a slave, the constant danger of her work as a conductor, and the emotional weight of being responsible for so many lives. It was no wonder, they reasoned, that she might now be grappling with something far deeper than what the world could see. But while those closest to her may have understood, the broader public was less sympathetic. Many viewed Tubman's behavior with a mixture of fear and pity. The idea that a woman who had once been a beacon of strength and resolve could now appear so vulnerable and disconnected from reality was difficult for many to accept. To some, it was simply too much to comprehend, too much to reconcile with the image of Tubman they had grown up hearing about. The very strength that had made her a hero now seemed like a weakness, something that had broken her. What Tubman was experiencing, her visions, her mental disarray, was not unique to her. It was the result of something far larger, a national trauma that had been ignored for too long. Harriet Tubman was not the only person who had been affected by the horrors of slavery. The toll of slavery on the human psyche was profound, something that had been largely overlooked in the rush to celebrate the heroes who had fought to end it. But Tubman, perhaps more than anyone else, embodied the lasting impact of those scars. The world could celebrate her achievements, could marvel at her bravery, but it was unwilling to truly see the damage slavery had caused. In the quiet corners of Auburn, as Tubman retreated further into her personal struggles, the stories of her troubled later years were left to echo in silence. The people who had once admired her from afar were now turning away. To some, she had become a figure of pity, a sad reminder of what had been lost. To others, she was a puzzle, a woman whose mind could not bear the weight of what she had witnessed and fought for. And for Tubman herself, the truth was far more complicated. She had always believed that her mission had been divinely inspired, that she had been chosen to lead others to freedom. But now, in her later years, she was left to grapple with the question of what all that sacrifice had truly cost her. The very people she had saved, the lives she had risked her own for, now seemed to fade into the background of her life. What had once been a mission driven by pure faith and the belief in a higher calling had become a series of unsettling visions and ghostly apparitions. For a woman whose life had been defined by action, by the constant push forward, this new world of internal struggle was alien and unwelcome. She had always been in control of her destiny, of the paths she took to ensure the safety of others. But now, in the silence of her later years, Tubman found herself unsure of which path to follow, her inner world in turmoil. It was a cruel irony that Tubman, a woman who had spent her entire life freeing others from the chains of oppression, found herself trapped in a different kind of bondage, a bondage of the mind, one that was deeply influenced by the psychological scars of her past. The harsh reality was that Tubman's later years were not just a time of personal struggle but also a period of denial from the world around her. The public had embraced the myth of Tubman the hero, but had failed to understand the woman behind the legend, the woman who, despite her incredible resilience, could not escape the ghosts of her past. And so, as Tubman's life in Auburn continued, the whispers about her mental state grew louder, but the true depth of her struggles remained unseen by most. What was clear, however, was that the strength that had once carried her through unimaginable challenges was now being tested in ways no one had anticipated. Her visions, her reclusive nature, and her declining health were all signs of a woman who had endured far more than most could ever comprehend. Yet, even in her moments of greatest vulnerability, Harriet Tubman remained a figure of profound resilience. She had fought for freedom, she had fought for others, and in the end, she was still fighting, not just for the lives of those she had saved, but for her own peace of mind. As the years wore on, the legacy of Harriet Tubman began to shift, not just in the eyes of the public but within the private corners of her own mind. The world she had once known, the world of brave escapes and carefully planned missions, seemed so far removed from the quiet, troubled life she now led. The stories of her daring exploits, of the lives she had saved, now seemed like distant memories that she could barely reach, buried beneath the weight of years and the ghosts that haunted her every thought. The fierce, indomitable spirit that had once driven her to lead enslaved people to freedom was now struggling to maintain its hold as the world around her changed. In Auburn, Harriet Tubman lived in a state of relative obscurity, her life largely separated from the public eye. The town that had once offered her a sanctuary from the dangers of the Underground Railroad was now a place where she found herself growing increasingly isolated. She had sought peace in this quiet, rural setting, hoping to find some semblance of rest after the grueling work she had done, the battles she had fought, and the lives she had touched. But peace was elusive. Her mind, weary from years of trauma and physical exhaustion, continued to be plagued by the memories of her past, and the very thing that had once given her strength, her connection to her purpose, began to slip further away. While Tubman's physical health had been compromised over the years, it was her mental state that seemed to be the most fragile. The conditions of her early life as an enslaved person had left indelible marks, not just on her body but on her psyche. She had endured physical abuse that would have broken most people, but she had also lived through horrors that most could never imagine, the brutal separations of families, the constant threat of death or punishment, the overwhelming weight of being treated as less than human. These experiences, though buried for a time beneath her commitment to the cause of freedom, had never really gone away. They festered, slowly eating away at her, until they finally came to the surface in the form of the haunting visions and dreams she began to experience in her later years. These spiritual encounters were not easily understood by those around her. Tubman's beliefs, which had once been so closely tied to her sense of purpose and mission, were now seen with growing suspicion. Some who had once revered her as a heroic figure now questioned the very nature of her spiritual experiences. Were these visions, in which she conversed with the dead, an extension of the faith that had guided her through her darkest days? Or were they symptoms of a troubled mind, overwhelmed by the weight of her past? To some, Tubman's behavior seemed to reflect a woman struggling with a fractured sense of self, a woman who had been marked by the horrors of slavery and could no longer find a way to reconcile her past with the present. In a way, Tubman had become a symbol of something much deeper than her role as a conductor on the Underground Railroad. She embodied the unspoken trauma of a generation of enslaved people whose pain was largely ignored or dismissed. While Tubman's contributions to the abolitionist cause were legendary, her suffering, both physical and psychological, was often glossed over. Her visions were never fully understood, nor were they ever explored with the depth and compassion they deserved. What was dismissed by others as eccentric behavior may have been, in truth, a deeply human response to a life lived under extreme duress. Tubman had always been a woman of deep faith, but her faith was now undergoing a profound transformation. It was no longer the faith of a young woman seeking freedom, a woman with a clear and undeniable mission. Now, it was a faith that sought answers to questions that had never been asked, a faith that tried to make sense of a life marked by incomprehensible loss and suffering. The visions that had once guided her with clarity now became more ambiguous, more unsettling. In these spiritual encounters, she would sometimes hear voices, some familiar, some strange, calling out to her, urging her to act. These voices, however, were no longer providing her with the direction they once had. Instead, they seemed to be offering fragments of the past, memories of lives that had been lost or left behind. As Tubman navigated these increasingly bewildering experiences, the community around her seemed to withdraw. Her once vibrant connection to the abolitionist movement was fading, and the support she had enjoyed in her earlier years seemed to dissipate. The town of Auburn, once home to so many abolitionists who admired her courage, was now a place where her reclusiveness seemed to isolate her further. It was difficult for people to reconcile the figure they had admired, the courageous, determined woman who had fought to liberate others, with the woman they saw before them, a fragile, emotionally scarred figure who was no longer able to escape the past that had shaped her. While Tubman did find comfort in the presence of her family, particularly her husband, and the few people who remained close to her, the emotional toll of her life seemed to consume her more as the years passed. The vast network of people she had once helped, the countless individuals she had guided to safety, now seemed distant to her. Tubman's life had been defined by her role as a leader and protector, but now, as she grew older, that role had been replaced by a different, quieter one. She was no longer guiding others to freedom, but instead was alone with her memories, her visions, and the haunting questions that had followed her for so long. Her family, too, was affected by the change in Tubman's behavior. They knew the woman who had been their matriarch, the woman who had led them through the darkness of slavery to a new life of freedom. But now, they were witnessing the woman who had once been a symbol of unyielding strength become a symbol of something far more tragic, the toll that slavery had taken on her soul. The psychological wounds that had been inflicted upon Tubman, and countless others like her, were now being laid bare in the form of her mental and emotional unraveling. For those who loved her, there was a deep sense of helplessness, an understanding that there was nothing they could do to ease the burden she carried. As Tubman grappled with her inner turmoil, the world around her continued to change. The abolition of slavery had given way to new struggles, as former slaves fought for their rights in the face of a deeply entrenched system of racial discrimination. Tubman, however, was no longer actively involved in the political movements of her time. She had fought her battles on the front lines, and now, in the twilight of her life, she found herself struggling with battles that were far more internal. The echoes of her past, those years of slavery, those nights of escape, those missions that had shaped the course of her life, were now all-consuming. Despite the isolation and internal struggle she faced, Harriet Tubman continued to be a figure of immense resilience, even in her final years. Her strength had been evident in every phase of her life, whether as a conductor on the Underground Railroad, as a spy during the Civil War, or as an advocate for the rights of women and African Americans. But in her final days, the resilience she exhibited was more subtle, more internal. It was not the bold, outward strength that had defined her early years, but the quiet determination to endure, to survive, and to continue moving forward in a world that had changed so much. In her final years, Tubman did not simply fade into obscurity. She remained a figure of complex strength, a woman whose life had been defined by so much more than the public story that had been written about her. Her struggle to maintain her faith, to make sense of her visions, and to survive the psychological toll of her past was a reflection of the broader experience of African Americans, particularly women, who had endured the ravages of slavery. Tubman's legacy was not simply one of triumph, it was also one of survival, of living with the scars of a painful past that could never fully be erased. By the time Harriet Tubman passed away in 1913, she had lived a life full of contradictions, courage and fear, strength and fragility, heroism and haunting memories. Her death marked the end of an era, but it also marked the beginning of a new understanding of the toll that slavery had taken on those who had fought against it. Tubman's story was not just a story of bravery and freedom, it was also a story of the lasting impact of trauma and the complexity of healing. In many ways, the true depth of Tubman's legacy can only be understood by acknowledging not just her courage but also her pain, and by recognizing the inner battles she faced long after the world had stopped asking her to lead. Harriet Tubman's later years, while marked by deep isolation and emotional turmoil, were also years where the legacy of her life began to take on a more complex shape. For many, the story of her courageous leadership and heroic actions was enough to secure her place in history. However, the complexities of her personal journey, the psychological and emotional weight she carried, were rarely discussed. In the years following the Civil War, when the excitement over the abolition of slavery had subsided and the reality of Reconstruction began to settle in, Tubman found herself at a crossroads. The world had moved on, and yet she was left to contend with an entirely different battle, one that was fought quietly, in the corners of her mind and heart. The landscape of America had shifted dramatically. The South had been defeated, slavery was abolished, and Tubman's once clear mission of helping enslaved people escape to freedom had come to an end. But this shift was not accompanied by a corresponding peace for Tubman. The years of harrowing escapes, of leading dozens through treacherous paths to the north, had taken a toll on her body and mind that no victory could erase. She had spent the majority of her life fighting for the freedom of others, often at great personal cost, and now, in the aftermath of the Civil War, there were no clear paths forward for her. The country she had fought so hard to liberate was in turmoil, and her own life had become more complicated than she could have imagined. In the quiet town of Auburn, New York, Tubman found a semblance of peace, but that peace was fragile. The town, which had offered her refuge, was also a place where her past and present collided in uncomfortable ways. For one, Auburn, like much of the nation, had been deeply affected by the racial divisions that continued to plague the country. Although it was a town known for its abolitionist roots, it was still a place where Tubman, as a black woman, faced the painful realities of segregation and discrimination. Her race was something she could never escape, not even in a place that had once supported the abolitionist movement. Tubman, despite her role in the liberation of so many people, was not immune to the racial prejudices that continued to shape the society around her. Furthermore, the personal toll of her work as an abolitionist was only becoming clearer to those closest to her. Her health, both physical and mental, continued to decline, and the emotional scars of her life seemed to grow deeper. Tubman's life had been a constant battle, first to survive, then to free others, and finally to find some kind of peace. But in Auburn, the battle was no longer external, it was internal, as she grappled with the weight of the losses she had endured and the horrors she had witnessed. The lives she had saved, the families she had helped to reunite, were now distant memories that seemed impossible to hold on to. The real cost of Tubman's heroism was not simply the years spent on the Underground Railroad, nor was it the physical toll of those years, it was the unseen toll, the psychological toll, that was beginning to take root in her later years. Though she had been a leader for so many, Tubman was now faced with the isolation that often accompanies great sacrifice. It wasn't just the physical and mental toll that had taken its toll on her. Tubman was also grappling with the deeper emotional questions that come when one's purpose has been fulfilled but the journey is not yet over. What was left for her now? How could she reconcile the heroism that had defined her life with the reality of the woman she had become, a woman whose mind was haunted by memories of lost loved ones and the unending brutality of slavery? Tubman's later years were marked by a kind of quiet struggle, one that was invisible to many, but deeply felt by her. Her visions, the spiritual experiences she often spoke of, were not comforting, they were unsettling, filled with images of suffering and loss. For years, she had relied on the guidance of her faith to navigate her life, but now, in her isolation, that faith seemed more ambiguous. The messages she received from the beyond were no longer reassuring, they were filled with confusion and disquiet. The voices she heard seemed to be calling her back to the past, urging her to continue a fight that had long since ended. But what fight was left? The war for freedom had been won, at least in the legal sense. Yet, the psychological scars of slavery remained, both for Tubman and for the country as a whole. And it was these scars, the invisible wounds, that Tubman found so difficult to escape. She had always been a woman of faith, but her faith was now tested in ways that had never been imagined. In her earlier years, Tubman had often described her faith as being the very foundation of her strength, a force that had helped her escape from slavery and lead others to safety. Now, her connection to the divine seemed to be fraying. The visions and voices she experienced in her final years were not the reassuring whispers of divine guidance she had once known. Instead, they seemed to be filled with chaos, confusion, and despair. Tubman was no longer sure of the direction she was being led in, and the familiar sense of purpose that had driven her for so many years had been replaced with uncertainty and doubt. For those around her, Tubman's spiritual struggles were difficult to understand. The people who had admired her as a fearless leader and a woman of profound faith now watched as she grappled with what seemed like a personal breakdown. Some of her family and friends were more sympathetic, understanding the toll that a lifetime of hardship had taken on her. But others, especially those who did not share her deeply spiritual beliefs, were unable to comprehend the intensity of her experiences. They saw a woman whose once unshakable faith was now unraveling before their eyes, and they struggled to find a way to help. Tubman's reclusiveness only deepened with time. While she had always been a solitary figure in many ways, her later years were marked by an increasing withdrawal from the world. Her health, both physical and mental, continued to deteriorate. Tubman's once sharp and energetic spirit seemed to fade, replaced by a quiet resignation that spoke to the profound toll of her past. Her visions, her dreams, the sense of divine purpose that had once driven her to risk her life for others, all of it seemed to be slipping through her fingers, leaving her in a state of disillusionment. But even as Tubman struggled with her inner demons, the legacy she had built remained in the background, waiting to be recognized. While she may have been distanced from the abolitionist movement in her later years, her earlier contributions to the cause were not forgotten. In her private moments, Tubman may have questioned whether her sacrifices had been worth the personal cost. But for the millions of people who had benefited from her bravery, who had found freedom through her efforts, her legacy would remain an enduring testament to the power of the human spirit. However, it was not just Tubman's physical and mental health that was deteriorating. Her financial situation, too, had become increasingly precarious. Despite her heroic efforts, Tubman was often financially unstable. She had spent much of her life focused on helping others, not on securing her own future. She had invested much of her energy into her work with the Underground Railroad and later into efforts to support other freed slaves, but she had never amassed the wealth or resources that would have ensured her comfort in her later years. This financial instability, combined with her declining health, led to further isolation. Tubman's public profile, once so prominent, had faded. She had no consistent source of income, and the people who might have been able to support her in her old age were themselves struggling. The result was that, while she had given so much of herself to others, few were there to give back to her when she needed it most. Tubman's later years were marked by a sense of quiet desperation, as she tried to navigate the difficult realities of her personal and financial situation. Her life, which had been defined by the grand pursuit of freedom, had now become focused on a much smaller, more personal battle for survival and peace of mind. In the end, Tubman's life after the Civil War, though often overshadowed by the heroic stories of her earlier years, was a powerful reminder of the lasting impacts of trauma, the difficulties of finding peace after a life of struggle, and the unacknowledged costs of heroism. Despite the external victory of freedom, Tubman was left with the profound internal cost of living through and surviving a lifetime of suffering. And while her vision of freedom had been realized for so many, her own personal freedom, that sense of peace and closure, remained elusive until the very end. Her life, like her legacy, was complicated, fraught with contradictions, and yet, in its own quiet way, a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit. As the years continued to unfold in Auburn, Harriet Tubman's existence settled into a rhythm marked by solitude and reflection. She was far removed from the days when she was a leading figure in the abolitionist movement and the Underground Railroad, yet her name still carried weight, even as her life slowed down. While much of the world had moved on to new struggles and challenges, Tubman remained trapped in a personal battle that no one outside her closest circle could fully understand. The physical scars of her past remained a constant reminder of the hardships she had endured, but it was the unseen scars, the emotional and psychological toll of her life, that weighed heaviest on her. Tubman's health, which had always been fragile, deteriorated over time. The toll of years spent escaping, rescuing, and fighting for the freedom of others had left its mark on her body. The physical exertion and the constant fear she had lived with during her years of service to the Underground Railroad had taken its toll, especially considering her narcolepsy, which only worsened as she aged. Her sleep episodes were increasingly unpredictable and disruptive, often leaving her incapacitated and vulnerable. She had no respite from the exhaustion of her body, which had been pushed to its limits for decades. But even more than her physical ailments, it was the emotional toll that seemed to have the greatest impact on her. Harriet Tubman had always been a woman of remarkable strength, known for her determination and her unyielding will to fight for freedom. But as time wore on, that same strength began to show signs of cracking under the pressure of the unresolved trauma of her past. Tubman had seen and experienced things that no human being should have to endure. Her life had been a constant battle, both against the brutality of slavery and the pervasive threat of violence that followed her wherever she went. Her escape from slavery had been an act of extreme courage, but it was also an act of desperation. She had been forced to leave behind everything she knew, her family, her home, and her entire way of life, to seek the fragile promise of freedom. The trauma of those early years never truly left her, and it resurfaced in her later years in ways that were both subtle and profound. Tubman's mind was often occupied with the faces of those she had lost along the way, people she had been unable to save, children separated from their mothers, and those who had died along the perilous routes of the Underground Railroad. It was this sense of responsibility, this feeling of never having done enough, that seemed to haunt her the most. For Harriet Tubman, the victories of her past were always tempered by the losses she had suffered. She had saved hundreds, but in her mind, she had not saved enough. The weight of the lives she had tried to save but could not, the faces of those who had perished, remained a constant presence in her life. The impact of this emotional burden was compounded by the fact that, despite her heroism, she was largely alone in her struggle. In the years following the Civil War, Tubman had become more isolated from the world she had once helped to shape. She was no longer in the spotlight, no longer the revered figure she had once been. The abolitionist movement had moved on to other causes, and while Tubman's name was still recognized, she had become, in many ways, a relic of the past. The activism that had once defined her life had faded, and she was left to live out her days in a small, quiet town where few understood the complexity of her journey. Her relationship with her community in Auburn was complicated. On one hand, Tubman was respected for her past contributions, her bravery, and the work she had done to help countless individuals escape slavery. But on the other hand, she was an outsider in many ways. She had been born into slavery, and her experiences had been shaped by a life that many could not fathom. Her race, too, continued to be a source of division. In a country still deeply entrenched in racism, Tubman, despite all she had accomplished, was still a black woman in a predominantly white society. In Auburn, as in many parts of the country, there were limits to how much she could truly belong. This sense of alienation added to the emotional toll she was already carrying, deepening her sense of loneliness and isolation. At times, Tubman seemed almost to be living in the shadow of her past. Her mind would often return to the days when she was leading groups of runaway slaves through the night, facing danger at every turn, always just a step ahead of the men and women who would stop at nothing to capture and punish her. These were memories that haunted her, but they were also memories that she clung to, because they represented a time when she had a clear and defined purpose. Now, in her later years, that sense of purpose had faded. What remained was the ghost of her former self, the woman who had led so many to freedom, but who could no longer find the same sense of direction in her own life. The deep psychological toll of Tubman's past was not just a product of the extreme conditions of slavery, but also the weight of being an outsider in a world that never truly understood her. While she had played an essential role in shaping the nation's fight for freedom, she was often forced to navigate the tensions of being black in a society that was unwilling to fully accept her, despite her heroism. Her isolation, both physical and emotional, was a reflection of the broader reality that black Americans, especially those who had been enslaved, were often forced to grapple with the trauma of their experiences alone. And yet, despite the crushing weight of her experiences and the solitude that seemed to define her later years, there was still something quietly remarkable about Tubman's ability to endure. Even in the face of immense psychological struggle, she continued to maintain a kind of quiet resilience. In her interactions with her family, friends, and the few people who still visited her, there was still a glimmer of the woman who had once been unstoppable. She was no longer the fiery leader who had defied the odds to lead hundreds to freedom, but she was still a woman who had lived a life of extraordinary courage, and that courage had not completely abandoned her. Tubman's quiet resilience in her later years was also marked by her continued sense of faith. Even as her mental state deteriorated and her physical health declined, she still turned to her faith for solace, even though it had become more difficult to reconcile the faith of her past with the reality of her present. She had always believed in the guidance of the divine, and in her final years, she sought solace in the spiritual realm. Her visions, though more disturbing than comforting, continued to serve as a source of connection to the world beyond. It is possible that, despite the darkness of her mind, these visions were her way of clinging to the hope that there was still a greater purpose for her life, that there was still meaning to be found in the suffering she had endured. As Tubman's health worsened, she became more and more reliant on the support of her family, particularly her second husband, Nelson Davis. They had married late in her life, and while their relationship was one marked by mutual love and respect, it was also one that came with its own set of challenges. Davis, who had also experienced the harsh realities of life as a black man in post-slavery America, understood the toll that Tubman's life had taken on her. He was there to care for her in her final years, and while their relationship was not one of public prominence, it was deeply meaningful to Tubman. In her final moments, it was Davis who remained by her side, a quiet but constant presence in her life. Tubman's final years were a time of quiet reflection, and though she was no longer the public figure she once had been, her legacy continued to grow in significance. Even in her last years, when she was no longer able to fight for the freedom of others in the same way, her story still served as a symbol of hope, of the capacity for courage in the face of unimaginable odds. Her life had been one of immense suffering, but it had also been a life of extraordinary triumphs. The legacy she left behind was not just the work she had done in her youth, but the quiet strength with which she had endured the darkness of her past in her later years. When Tubman passed away in 1913, her death marked the end of an era, but it also marked the beginning of a new chapter in the narrative of American history. Her story would go on to inspire future generations of activists, freedom fighters, and individuals who would carry the torch of liberation forward. The struggles she faced in her final years, while difficult and painful, were part of the larger story of survival and resilience that defined her life. Harriet Tubman had spent her life fighting for the freedom of others, but in the end, it was her own inner strength, her ability to endure, that proved to be her greatest legacy. In the years following the Civil War, Harriet Tubman found herself in a new world, a world that had been fundamentally altered by the abolition of slavery. The triumphant victory for freedom, which she had fought so tirelessly to achieve, had brought about significant change, but not the kind of change that Tubman had imagined. The promises of Reconstruction were fleeting, and the racial struggles that defined the post-war era created an atmosphere of uncertainty, not just for former slaves, but for those who had fought alongside them for emancipation. For Tubman, this period represented a time of profound disillusionment, as the world around her failed to live up to the ideals she had sacrificed so much for. While she had been an unrelenting force on the front lines of the abolitionist movement, her post-war life would be marked by a different kind of battle, one that was fought in the quiet spaces of her mind and in the shadows of her past. After the Civil War, Tubman found herself in the position of not just a hero, but a woman left to navigate the difficult realities of a society that had yet to fully reckon with the aftermath of slavery. The emotional and psychological scars of her past were still fresh, and although the country had officially declared freedom for African Americans, the deep societal divisions and the systemic racism that had been entrenched for centuries did not disappear overnight. The promise of freedom was not an easy one to realize. The road ahead for former slaves and abolitionists was fraught with challenges that extended beyond the physical realm and into the psychological and emotional landscapes of those who had been affected by slavery's long reach. Harriet Tubman, once an active and vital part of the struggle for freedom, now found herself living in a world where her role had changed. The abolition of slavery, though momentous, left Tubman with a sense of emptiness that she struggled to reconcile. Her fight had always been about saving lives, leading the enslaved to freedom, helping them find a new life beyond the borders of oppression. Yet, in the aftermath of the war, the goalposts had shifted. The political changes were profound, but they did little to heal the deep scars that slavery had left on the minds and hearts of those who had experienced it firsthand. Tubman, having devoted her life to freeing others, was now left to navigate a personal kind of freedom that she found difficult to understand or accept. Though she had helped countless people escape the shackles of slavery, Tubman was not immune to the lingering effects of those same chains. Her own freedom, although one in the legal sense, had not granted her the peace she had hoped for. The trauma she had experienced, the brutality she had witnessed, and the lives she had been unable to save continued to haunt her. These ghosts from the past, though not tangible, were as real as any physical wound, and they followed her even into the peaceful town of Auburn, where she had hoped to rest. The fact that she had made it through, that she had survived the unimaginable, did not mean that her mind or spirit had been untouched by the darkness she had lived through. While the legal status of African Americans had changed, the social fabric of the country was still deeply divided. For Tubman, this was perhaps the most disheartening aspect of the post-war world. The idea that freedom could simply be declared did not seem to address the systemic racism and prejudice that continued to shape the experiences of black people across the nation. Even in the North, where Tubman had found refuge, racial tensions were still deeply rooted. In Auburn, a town that prided itself on its abolitionist history, Tubman was still seen as an outsider in many ways. While there was respect for her past, there was also a discomfort that came with her presence. As a black woman in a predominantly white community, Tubman was never fully integrated into the social fabric of the town. This racial divide, though more subtle in the North than in the South, was a constant reminder that her struggle was far from over. As the years passed, Tubman's isolation deepened. She had spent much of her life in motion, constantly moving from one mission to the next, from one crisis to another. But in her later years, that same sense of purpose had slipped away, and she found herself unable to navigate the still waters of post-war life. The world had moved on, but Tubman, in many ways, had not. The trauma of her past, the violence, the fear, and the loss, had shaped her in ways that no one could have anticipated. And as much as she tried to settle into a life of peace, she found that peace was elusive. Her psychological struggles were not uncommon for those who had been subjected to the brutality of slavery. Tubman's narcolepsy, which had been a constant in her life for years, worsened in her later years, leaving her physically and mentally exhausted. The condition, which caused her to fall into sudden and uncontrollable sleep episodes, was just one of the many ways her body and mind had been affected by the years of strain she had endured. These episodes, which left her disoriented and vulnerable, served as a constant reminder of her fragility. At times, she could barely remember what had happened during her waking hours, and the world around her seemed to slip through her fingers like sand. In addition to this, her visions, which had once been a source of spiritual guidance, began to take on a darker tone. The voices and dreams that had once comforted her were now filled with a haunting sadness, the echoes of a past she could not escape. Her faith, which had once been an unshakable source of strength, also began to falter. Tubman had always believed that she was divinely guided, that her actions were part of a greater plan. But now, in her later years, those spiritual experiences became more unsettling. The visions, once filled with divine clarity, became increasingly confusing and disturbing. The sense of purpose that had once propelled her forward now seemed to slip further out of her reach. For a woman whose entire life had been defined by a sense of divine mission, this loss of connection was particularly painful. The spiritual strength that had once been her foundation was now fading, and in its place, there was a profound sense of disillusionment. Tubman, who had once felt the presence of God in every step she took, now struggled to feel that same connection. The psychological toll of Tubman's life, combined with the physical challenges she faced in her later years, made it increasingly difficult for her to maintain the same level of involvement in the causes she had once championed. Though she remained committed to the fight for equality and justice, her energy and health were no longer able to keep up with the demands of her activism. The fiery spirit that had once driven her to take extreme risks to secure freedom for others was now tempered by a quiet resignation, a woman who had given everything and was now trying to make sense of a world that no longer seemed to need her.